Since my topic is working wages, they decided to work me as harder than the rest. Have two in a row here. There's another reason for all that. But working wages or labor economics, another very big topic. And so I thought I'd do what I did in the last talk and just try to outline some of the Austrian approaches or Austrian viewpoints on working wages. But the first question is, why do people work? Beyond money and fringe benefits, what is it, what are reasons some people give for getting up and going to work every day? And it's, for most people, for some people it might be just the money. Certainly that's probably the big thing, the big reason why people put up with working. And it's not the reason why I'm here. I guarantee you it's not the money that attracts me to come to Alabama in August every year for a week. But what other reasons would people give for working besides the money? People do give other reasons. Who would like to volunteer? Don't worry about making an ass of yourself. Other people will do the same.
Maybe what it is that they do, they enjoy doing it.
Sure. People enjoy doing what they're doing. Why do you think Lance Armstrong, his work is riding a bike? But the real work is working out like a demon 12 months out of the year to be able to do what he does. And he obviously enjoys it. I saw him on TV last night. He's like on drugs talking about how he loves bicycle riding. He loves doing it. But I think you had your hand on. Yeah, you.
Maybe there's a brotherhood of the workers that allows man to reach his full potential.
Okay. What was your name, comrade? I didn't see your name. Well, another way to put that is a lot of people do. That's sort of a big part of their social life is where they meet people. It's their friends. It's a big part of who they know socially too. So. A lot of people, work is a big part of your life as far as your interaction with other human beings. Not me, I'm a reclusive academic, but other people.
Basic premise of economics, humans act. And so to not do so, to be lethargic, it would be unnatural.
We have quite a few unnatural people, though, in America who are bribed into being unnatural by welfare.
Well, they're generally pretty unhappy, too.
That's true. Not much utility.
Your parents would kick you out of the house.
Threats of punishment. Yeah, that could be it. Yeah. What else? What do you think?
To afford the things that you can't provide for yourself. The division of labor.
Well, sure, the division of labor. One of my classes, I have students read the Communist Manifesto, and there's one passage in there I can't remember exactly where Marx and Engels say that under communism you can be a farmer in the morning and a theater critic in the evening and a poet in the afternoon. No division of labor at all, and I remember one student saying only an ignorant child could believe such a thing, but of course millions upon millions of people, including most college faculty in the humanities and social sciences, believe that. But that's a good point. The division of labor. That's I like to live in a nice house, but I didn't build my house. In fact, I am one of the worst perpetrators of outsourcing in America. I outsource for all my food. I don't grow my own food. I even outsource for my automobiles. I've never once made my own automobile. I outsource for all that. I even outsourced to get my hair cut yesterday. I don't even cut my own hair. So I outsource damn near everything. And so Paul Craig Roberts will be writing an article about me sometime soon.
To satisfy your own need.
Right, that's the main thing. You might satisfy your own need, or you might have particular wishes, pride of workmanship. Some people like to take pride in what they do, what they're creating. So there are a lot of reasons. We could go on for a long time thinking of reasons why people get some bit of enjoyment, or whether it's pride or something out of what they're doing. And in human action, Mises, they're one of the funnier lines that I have actually had to. I didn't want to repeat all of it in polite company, but he says Mises says there are, for example, occupations which meet erotic desires. So he's giving a list of why people like to work. And it reminded me of John Stossel. My two students over here have seen a whole bunch of John Stossel videos. I show them in my classes, but he did one on economic liberty in America and around the world, and he was making the case that if you have a regime of economic liberty and economic freedom, it means the toleration, having tolerance to allow people to get into lots of different occupations where you might not personally approve of the morality of what they're doing, but it's important to tolerate this in a free society. And one example he gave, he went to some New York City sex show, and he interviewed some woman dressed in a leather bikini who said, "I'm very good with a bullwhip." She's on ABC News, and that has to be what Mises was thinking about, that kind of thing. When he's so there are some people. And the reason I'm bringing all this up, why do people work? Mostly they're in it for the money. Why? So they can participate in the international division of labor, as he mentioned, because civilization cannot exist without the division of labor. We're back into the Stone Age if we don't have that. The reason I brought this up is that anti-capitalistic propaganda has always been based in part on an attack on work and the work ethic, and there's the agenda behind it, or the reason behind it, is to try to persuade workers that they should hate their work, because why? Because the work is really you're being a victim of some sort of unjust social system. That's why you're working. You're being forced to work like more or less a slave. And there is no joy to it. There is no pride to it. It's an unjust social system where the capitalist is exploiting you. And so it's always been a part of the anti-capitalistic agenda to try to sort of demonize work and to ignore the whole idea that work is more than just money. It's mostly money for most people, but there can be a lot more to work than that. And I wasn't really kidding when I said that I'm not here for the money. I'm not getting rich coming to Alabama in August for a week. We get paid. The faculty get paid, but still, we don't expect to become rich doing this. In fact, very few faculty in general are very wealthy, unless they're a really highly successful textbook seller, something like that. But you look at somebody like Walter Block, who clearly loves being up here and doing what he's doing. He's like a missionary, and most of the faculty are. And we enjoy doing that. We even enjoy talking to all of you for a little bit, for short amounts, not a lot. And so that's the point I wanted to make about the joy. Mises calls it the joy of labor. Okay, now wages. One of the things that the labor union movement has screamed about is they've announced that labor is not a commodity. Well, yes, it is. Well, by commodity, what does that mean? Its price is set by supply and demand. It's a commodity. The economically ignorant will tell you that what economists mean by this statement is that we view people as like a commodity, as a chunk of lead or a piece of lumber or something like that, which is just stupid. The only meaning of this is that it's recognizing the reality that wages are set by supply and demand. And so how are they set by supply and demand? Well, of course, supply is easy enough, the supply side of the labor market, although I think you have to realize that a lot of the supply in the various industries is the result of self-selection, so that even in this day and age, it's still true that in certain occupations like clerical work, primary and secondary education, overwhelmingly married women. Okay, overwhelmingly. Why? These are occupations where if you want to quit for a few years after having children, you can, and then you can go back to it. Self-selection. As a result, the market is flooded with married women who have qualifications to do these jobs, and as a result, the wages are lower than they would otherwise be if there weren't so many millions of married women who are teachers, real estate agents, clerical workers, things like that. It's changed a lot in the last 30 or 40 years, but it's still true that that we have this. So a lot of this is a self-selection. On the demand side, Walter Block mentioned this morning, when we talk about the demand for labor, the phrase that economists use is marginal revenue product of labor has two components. It's the price of the good or service that's being sold, price of Q's quantity, times the marginal product excuse me, of the good, the marginal physical product, and that's called marginal revenue product of labor. So the marginal physical product, I guess you could put another P in there. If I'm running a golf ball factory, and you, my employee, produce 1,000 golf balls a week at my working in my golf ball manufacturing machine, and I sell them at 50 cents a piece. Okay, your marginal revenue product is $500. So it pays me to pay you up to $500 a week. If I pay you exactly $500 a week, I break even. And so the two components of the demand, major components of essentially what constitutes a demand for labor, is the price at which the product sells and the marginal or additional productivity of the worker in producing the physical product or the service in the service industry. And so if you break these down, what the first element here really says is that for the most part, it's the consumer who's in charge. If the product being produced is popular with consumers, the price is being bid up on the market, the price, not the price of labor, but the price of the final product, labor becomes more valuable to the employer, because if this golf ball now becomes the golf ball, it goes farther than the other golf balls, and now you can get $5 for them, not 50 cents. Now these laborers are all of a sudden much more valuable to the employer, because if they're not there, he's losing $5 for every golf ball that is not sold, whereas he used to be losing only 50 cents for every golf ball that is not sold, which is bad enough. But if he's losing $5 for every one that's not made and sold, you're much more valuable to him, even though you're the same person, the same skill. You haven't changed at all. You might even become dumber, as far as the employer knows. But you're more valuable to him, just not for anything you did. It's the market. It's the consumer. Okay, that's why the demand for labor is called a derived demand for labor. It's ultimately derived from the demand for the product. Okay, and so it's a major ingredient of what you're worth on the marketplace. That is what people value the product or service you're producing at. The consumer is in charge, and so the consumer really ultimately determines wage patterns. How popular the thing is that you're making. And ever since I started teaching at the university level in 1979 when I finished my PhD, and I've been at several different universities during this time, and at every single one, it's always the history professors who bitch about being underpaid. Underpaid. As though when they went to graduate school, they thought they were going to be millionaires instantly by being a history professor, and then they get their first job and they say, "What happened?" And they're not paying. Well, the market is different for history. The place is flooded with history professors. There aren't quite as many economics professors, because we make it excruciatingly hard to get a PhD. Not as hard as I'd like to see it, but make it excruciatingly hard. Okay, and of course, marginal revenue, the marginal physical product, there are a lot of elements to that too. One of the main ingredients of this is capital investment by the employer. Not by you, the employee, but by the employer. The amount of capital, when the employer invests in capital, which is used in combination with the employees or labor, it increases the marginal product of labor. If you're using an old defunct machine that can produce one golf ball a day, and your employer invests in a new machine that can spit out 1,000 golf balls a day, you, the employee, are no different. You're no more productive than you were yesterday. But to the employer, you're 1,000 times more valuable, because he needs you to work that machine. Okay, and that's a major ingredient, a major reason why wages have gone up over time in the capitalist countries, is capital investment by entrepreneurs. Okay, nothing that the workers themselves did. And the other element, of course, is human capital investment. Is genuine, the accumulation of knowledge, skill, know-how by the workers themselves. That makes you more valuable, of course. Okay, and so on the demand side, if you want to know why over time wages have gone up in the United States, almost since the beginning of the Republic, it's been about 3.5% per year on average for a couple hundred years. And so if you just simply look at the marginal revenue product of labor, or it was sort of a synonym for demand for labor and supply, population has been increasing, but the marginal revenue product has been increasing a little faster, and is thanks primarily to capital investment, which increases the productivity of labor. Okay, or the marginal productivity of labor. Now, one of the fallacies in labor markets that you see all the time is the notion that there's some sort of monopoly demand for labor that implies sort of a collusion or conspiracy among employers to hold wages down. Okay, and therefore laborers are exploited. And Walter Block covered this in his own way this morning when he was talking about the minimum wage. And what exploitation means is, in economics anyway, is generally in a competitive labor market, the wage will be bid up pretty close to the marginal revenue product of labor. Okay, exploitation means you're being paid significantly below that. I think Walter this morning gave an example of a capitalist pig paying somebody 1 penny when their marginal revenue product was $2 an hour, but the capitalist pig pays them 1 penny. And so, but any time an employer pays an employee significantly below the marginal revenue product, that creates a profit opportunity for a rival employer, for a rival company, rival business. Okay, and how does it do that? If I'm paying my employee 1 penny an hour, and that employee is producing for me $2 an hour worth of golf balls, then I can have my competitors bid him away for 5 cents an hour, and they'll want to earn that gap between the 5 cent and the $2 that he's producing. And in a competitive labor market, that'll be bid up to 10 cents, 15 cents, 50 cents, and so forth, because there's still going to be a profit potential there if you're exploiting these workers. And so just if you understand the process of competition, you understand that this is a very remotely, very unlikely thing that there would be this type of exploitation, because employers do compete with one another for the best. They do it all the time. You see it every day in the world, in the newspapers. Just look at professional baseball. Their teams are constantly competing with one another, trading players and so forth. And the players are doing all they can to be traded so they can get a higher salary. That doesn't just happen in baseball. Everybody just about tries to do that to some degree. Okay, so their labor markets are pretty competitive in that regard. This is actually a precursor to what's called the economics of discrimination in mainstream economics. But Mises explained this whole phenomenon very clearly decades before some of the mainstream economists. The two early books on this were one by Gary Becker and one by Kenneth Arrow. I think they both were called The Economics of Discrimination, and with regard to racial discrimination. But they mentioned the same phenomenon. If you have an employer who, whether it's racial discrimination or sex discrimination, say he's a, what's the word for men who hate women? They're misogynist, yeah. Say you're an employer and you're a misogynist, and so you have a male and female employees. Say you have accountants working for you, and you pay the male accountant $50,000 a year, and you pay the female accountant $30,000 a year, even though she is exactly identically qualified. And so you're exploiting her. You're paying her $20,000 less than her marginal revenue product. How does that create a profit opportunity for somebody else? What's likely to happen? I would argue that it does.
They'll pay her $35,000 instead of $50,000 that she's worth.
There's a motivation for somebody to pay her $35,000, and so she'll she'll go there presumably. But if they're still exploiting her, there's still a motivation to pay her 40, so that eventually she'll be paid somewhere close to her marginal revenue product. And then when you think about it, the misogynist will be left with all men at $50,000 a year, let's say. In the meantime, the competition will have men and women being paid, somewhat lower. Until you reach that equilibrium point where everyone's paid their marginal revenue product, the competitors will have a cost advantage because of discrimination. And that's the basic idea behind Gary Becker and Kenneth Arrow's Economics of Discrimination, but it's no different than what Mises wrote about in terms of exploitation in general, not just based on sex or race, but just productivity. Somebody else had a hand comment?
Sorry, is the marginal product of their marginal product of labor, or the marginal product of labor that they could get at their next best use of their next best job? Because
No, we're talking about their marginal product of labor for the current employer.
But why would the employer pay that if the employee has, say, that job specific education or whatever? Why would the employer pay that and not just above the next best alternative job that they could find?
Competition forces him to. He doesn't live in a vacuum. He doesn't operate in a vacuum. He's forced to pay in that through competition. If somebody else will, if he doesn't, can somebody get that phone? Whose phone is that? Another aspect of this cartel theory is that cartels always break down. So there's the idea that there could be an employer cartel where they would all agree to pay workers a penny an hour. There's a big incentive to cheat on that cartel by paying them two pennies an hour, and getting that productive employee who can produce $2 or $3 or $5 an hour for you, and paying him more than a penny an hour where he's being exploited in the current place. And so that doesn't make much sense either, the cartel breakdown theory. In fact, the only place where this is possible to have a cartel of employers is under socialism, because under pure socialism there is one employer, the state. And so that's the only place where it's possible to truly exploit workers under the ideal Marxian system of socialism. That's where the real exploitation can happen, because employees have no alternatives. There is no competitive labor market under genuine socialism. Okay. Unemployment. Mises and the Austrians refer to what they call catalactic unemployment. Mainstream economists really call the same thing voluntary unemployment. Same thing, but the word is catalactic unemployment. What reasons could you think of for why people are unemployed voluntarily? Okay, not enough salary. You're not willing to work at such at a particular wage. Yeah, there are a lot of lazy Americans like that. You see them on television all the time. I'm a high school dropout. I've been on drugs for the past 20 years. $10 an hour, forget it. That's from another John Stossel video. There was that. So yeah, you might even if you're not a high school dropout who's on drugs. A lot of people just don't want to work for $10 an hour. Yeah, okay, or less than $10 an hour.
But maybe it's not need for
Yeah, I guess if you're like Ted Kennedy, for example, something like that. So, yeah, okay. I was in Cape Cod last week, and I actually visited Hyannis, near where Ted drove that woman off the bridge and killed her. 40 years ago, or 42 years ago, somebody had a sign that said, will someone please ask Ted Kennedy to drive Hillary home from the convention? Right in Hyannis, Massachusetts. But, what are the reasons? Why would people voluntarily be unemployed? For a while, not forever, but for a while.
start a rock band or pursue some sort of art.
Yeah, start a rock band. Yeah, well, between jobs. You could quit your job sitting in a cubicle at IBM and do something else. Yeah, sure, people are between jobs or between careers or whatever, okay?
I was going to say to raise families.
Yeah, well, if you're talking about the typical pattern of mothers becoming unemployed in the marketplace. Yeah, and some men, I forget, it's very small. A good friend of mine, his wife runs a successful business that she makes good money. He quit his government job because he wasn't making that much anyway, and he raises their 2 daughters, and he says he wears the panties in the family, is what he tells me. I don't think he means literally, but I think that's still a very, very tiny part of American society. But yeah, still, but there are people who do that.
Because there's no job available, let's say a seasonal business, for example.
Sure, seasonal variations. Like if you're in the construction business in Minnesota, where they don't build many houses in January, it's too cold, the ground is frozen. Yeah, no, that's. Yeah.
I just had a question. Are we talking about the more classical definition of unemployment, where you're looking for a job and you can't find one? Because some of these, if you're not really looking for a job, you wouldn't be considered part of the labor force.
Yeah, that's the government's definition of the labor force. That's a discouraged worker, as they call it. Yeah, but I'm just talking about reasons why people would be unemployed, not having a job, whether they're looking for a job or not. I guess. Yeah, I guess if any of these, if you search long enough without success, you might become discouraged and start living in a box on a sidewalk or something. I suppose. Or unwillingness. Someone mentioned unwillingness to work for a certain salary, or to do an undesirable job. A job that's too dirty or too cold or something like that. So, and you can think of more reasons. So there are a lot of reasons for this catalactic unemployment. But the more important type of unemployment that Austrians tend to dwell on more is institutional unemployment. And institutional unemployment is basically caused by interventionism. And Walter mentioned the minimum wage, so I don't really have to go over the minimum wage again. There's a big literature on what's called mandated benefits, that is government-mandated employment benefits, but the language here is biased because anytime the government mandates a benefit, it also mandates a cost to whoever has to pay for that benefit. But they always only call them benefits. They never call them mandated costs. Like, the minimum wage law is a mandated benefit, but it's also a mandated cost to a lot of people. If the government mandates that employers provide for daycare for their employees, that's a mandated cost to employers and a mandated benefit to whoever benefits from it. And what these things all do, if you look at the basic employment decision, is the employer compares the wage, which this is a proxy for compensation. A big chunk of compensation is fringe benefits these days. They'll pay a wage up to the marginal revenue product of labor in a competitive labor market. But any kind of government mandated benefit will increase the compensation level and therefore lead to a situation where the employee could be priced out of a job if by law you have to pay more than what the employee is worth. And of course, another thing that happens is employers will cut back on other types of remuneration. So whenever you have the government mandating any kind of remuneration, whether it's a minimum wage law or mandatory health insurance or mandatory parental leave or anything like that, two possible things can happen. One, you can raise the compensation above productivity levels for some employees, usually the younger, less experienced ones who don't have as high a marginal revenue product as the older, more experienced workers do. And there's also the possibility of cutting back on salary or other benefits, even turning the air conditioning down. If you tell me I have to pay the employees in my factory 1 week of vacation pay per year, well, the only way I can afford that is to have no air conditioning instead of having air conditioning. So, and of course, air conditioning would be a bit of a benefit of the job if you're in Alabama in the summertime, for example. And that's just one example, but there are a lot of ways where employers can cut back on other types of remuneration or things that benefit the employees there. So sometimes you can't really benefit the employees no matter what you do, passing laws, and other times you can only harm them. So you can either do nothing for them or make them worse off by pricing them out of their jobs generally. Although some people do benefit. I used to have an article in my files. It's kind of dated now. It's probably still true. It was an article from the New York Times, and maybe I should have brought it in so I could show you the picture. It was about Germany, and there was a picture of this man in Germany who looked like he'd been drinking a lot of beer for a lot of years, and it said that in Germany they have a law that every other year employers probably, I don't know if it was the major corporations or it's probably not all businesses, like most countries like the U.S. exempt the smaller businesses, but has to send their employees for a 2-week paid vacation at a health spa. And the rationale is that your health care costs will go down in the long run if you send your employees to a 2-week paid vacation at a health spa. And so they showed this guy, he was having a good time, drinking beer and reading the new magazine, and he's at the swimming pool, he had his shirt off, and who wouldn't like that? Who wouldn't like to go on a 2-week vacation at a spa for free? You know, the thing is, it's not for free. It's you, the employee, are paying for it or most of it. And in some cases, there's a big, not a controversy, a bit of a debate in economics over the effect of these types of things, which are much higher in Europe, Western Europe especially, than here in the U.S. The mandated benefits. And some people think it's a major cause of why employment has been much slower, the job creation in Europe in the past 30 years or so than it has in the U.S. because they have much higher levels of these mandated benefits, which increases the compensation level. So when you hire somebody in Germany, it costs more to hire the same person in the U.S. because of these benefits that are there. And as a result, there's less hiring in places like that. The same article had an article about, I think it was Belgium, where a man who was laid off, lost his job at an American corporation in Belgium, and the law required the American corporation to pay him $80,000 in severance pay, even though he had already gotten a new job to start on Monday. So this is on a Friday, he was quitting, and he had to be paid $80,000 severance pay. And there's nothing bad about severance pay if you enter into a contract that says you're a valued person, you're a highly skilled engineer, let's say, and we'd like you to work for us, and if we have to lay you off in the future, we'll pay you 3 months severance pay. That's part of contracts all the time. But $80,000 mandated by the Belgian government is a different matter altogether. And so what this article said was that companies like this were deciding to no longer locate in Belgium because of things like this, because it was too expensive to hire. They'd go locate in Ireland instead or someplace else where they didn't have these sorts of things. Okay, unemployment insurance. Government unemployment insurance causes unemployment. How do you think that works? Anyone would like to venture a...
It lowers the cost of not having a job, and it raises the cost to employers who pay the unemployment insurance for hiring people.
Right, it's a tax. There's an unemployment insurance tax, so there's less money to use to run your business, which includes hiring people, for one thing. And there's what we call a moral hazard problem. The buzzword that economists use is moral hazard. And in theory, unemployment insurance is supposed to alleviate the effects of unemployment. But what you're doing is, if you look at the law of demand, like you said, you're lowering the cost of being unemployed. If you can make 60% of your pay without having to get up in the morning and get out of bed and go to and work 40 hours a week and pay for lunch, pay for gasoline, and so forth, it's not a bad deal. And I think that's the average in the U.S. It doesn't last forever. I think it can last for 2 years now on average. But 60% of your pay is pretty darn good. It differs state by state in the U.S. And so what you do is encourage people to be unemployed longer. Unemployment insurance. Government spending in general causes unemployment. Okay, I know that's not the typical Keynesian answer, but government spending in general, because after all, every dollar the government spends has to come out of the private sector one way or another, through taxes. If it prints money and creates inflation, it reduces the value of privately held wealth. If it goes into debt, it can crowd out private borrowing, can raise interest rates. No matter how the government finances its spending, it has to take resources, reallocate them from the private sector, which causes unemployment. After all, employment, the demand for labor, remember, is a derived demand for labor. And so all government spending and all taxing causes unemployment. And one of the clearest examples of this is at the end of World War II, the federal budget in absolute dollars fell. I think the amounts were, the numbers were something like from 95 billion to around 35 billion from 1945 to 1947. Now, any of you who have ever taken a course in introductory macroeconomics at the college level, what would you think that textbook that you use would predict if in absolute terms government spending fell by 2/3, like it did right after World War II when the American military was demobilized? Massive unemployment, because the big component of aggregate demand had gone down, but that's not what happened. We had an economic boom because all those resources were put back into the productive private sector as opposed to the public sector. And in fact, at one of the Mises Institute's anniversary dinner, was it 2 years ago now, a year and a half ago now, one of our friends, James Ostrowski, who writes on Lou Rockwell's website quite often, his father was I sat next to his father who was there, and he was a Battle of the Bulge veteran in World War II, and he was there at the end of World War II, and he stayed on after the war was over in the military for a while, and he was telling us stories of how they literally got bulldozers and bulldozed all the tanks and things off cliffs because it was too expensive to bring them back to the U.S., so they just pushed them out into the ocean off cliffs in France, I guess he was somewhere. And so you got all this. After all, war is the opposite of capitalism. War is about destroying capital, and even when war is over, they keep destroying capital by throwing this stuff away, all these tanks and everything. And so all this wasteful, destructive activity was transformed into productive activity in terms of money being put in the pockets of private citizens. And that's what caused the boom. So government spending always causes unemployment. There are federal laws like the Davis-Bacon Act. Does anybody know what the Davis-Bacon Act is? Anybody here? Not a single person. You know what bacon is, right? You're too old. I'm not going to ask you. You've been around too long. You know what it is? Well, you were in my class, so you probably know what it is.
Is that the prevailing wage law?
Yeah, it's also called prevailing wage. If you're a contractor, say a construction contractor, and you're doing some kind of job, building a road or doing a bridge or something like that, and it involves it's a federal contract, and the state and local state governments also have state Davis-Bacon laws, prevailing wage laws. You have to pay what's called the prevailing wage, which is usually the highest union wage they can find anywhere within hundreds of miles of where it is. It's supposed to be in the vicinity, but they usually fish around for the highest wage you can find at a union job site. And the purpose of this is to price out of the market non-union labor. So it's sort of a variant on the minimum wage law, because I'll give you an example of it. In Baltimore, where I work, when they built Camden Yards, the baseball stadium, I happened to be at a hearing of the state legislature on labor issues where I was a witness a couple years ago, and they were talking about minority contracting for the new football stadium. This was right before they built the Ravens football stadium several years ago. And they said that, when we built Camden Yards, there were all these minority contractors that didn't get contracts, and they're complaining bitterly, and they wanted a quota. At this hearing I was at, they wanted a quota for minority contractors. Just give them a certain percentage, racial minorities, a certain percentage of the work, regardless of what they would bid for the jobs for. And what nobody mentioned was there was a good reason why these minority contractors didn't get much of the work in building Camden Yards, the baseball stadium. It was the state version of the prevailing wage law, because you might have had a construction company set up by some minority guy who was a carpenter for years and years and years, and he taught some of his friends carpentry, maybe put them through some apprentice school in carpentry, but they're not the old unionized carpenters who have been around for a long time, highly skilled because they've had a lot of experience. They're relatively new, and because they're relatively new and less experienced, they charge less. They don't have as high a wage as the older, more experienced, unionized carpenters do. And so that gives them an edge in bidding for jobs. They can put in a bid to do a particular work of carpentry at less than the higher priced unionized carpenters can. But they can't with the prevailing wage law. The prevailing wage law says you have to pay these guys who have a lower marginal revenue product because they're less experienced, the same as you pay the most highly paid people within 500 miles. And so if these guys have a marginal revenue product on average of $1,000 a week, the prevailing wage law might say you have to pay them $1,500 a week if you're going to hire them to do this job. That's a pretty easy decision. It's not worth it to hire them. We're going to hire the unionized guys. And so the prevailing wage laws cause unemployment among the lesser skilled, mostly non-union labor. Okay, and that's that. The child and female labor restrictions certainly causes unemployment by making it illegal to work. You can't get much more clear than that. Now, this is one of these things that sounds appealing, limiting child labor. But what are we talking about? There was a push during the Clinton administration by Robert Reich, who was the labor secretary, and I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. In the 1980s, when he was a professor, he called himself Robert Reich, and then when he became labor secretary, all of a sudden he was Robert Reich. So I don't know what the deal is. It's like a friend of mine who wrote a book, and everybody knows him as Ed. And his middle name is Jonathan. And his wife convinced him that he should call himself Jonathan because it sounds better on a book than Ed. So all his friends are confused. They saw this book he wrote, and who is this guy? So Reich changed his name too. But he had a big push against teenage labor during his administration. He was limiting the hours teenagers could work at McDonald's and things like that, because everybody knows it's much more productive for a 16-year-old to be roaming around the mall than working at McDonald's. And so that's been around for a long time, child labor restrictions. And mostly it was at the impetus came from labor unions, mostly labor unions, and so who didn't want teenagers competing. And Walter Block gave an example of that this morning. The minimum wage law is in the same category of for example, if I want to paint my house this summer, I can hire 2 college students at $10 an hour, maybe to do the same work as one professional 40-year-old union guy who's been painting for a long time, who makes $20 an hour. I can assume I can get the same exact work done for the same money, only with the 2 college guys. I pay them $10 an hour a piece, and I pay the one pro $20 a piece. But if you have a law that tells me I have to pay the 2 college guys at least $15 an hour, I'm not going to hire them. I can get the exact same work done by the one older guy. And so child labor, the restrictions on child labor, I think, have always been motivated by the same thing, to reduce competition with unions, not so much humanity. Some of you may have remembered how Kathy Lee Gifford was trashed a few years ago by the media. Does anybody remember that? Kathy Lee Gifford, she used to be on TV. Most people seem to hate her, but she was real popular on TV. But she had a clothing line that was sold at Kmart, and somebody discovered horror that it was clothes were made in Indonesia, and there were children working in the factories, and so that's a horrible thing. But what is the alternative to some of these children who are working in a factory at very low pay? It might be child prostitution or crime or starvation. And so the unions, patting themselves as champions of children in the third world, advocated policies such as paying these kids $10 an hour rather than $1 a day, which is probably close to their marginal revenue product in places like this. They were advocating policies that would have kicked them out of work in favor of American unionized textile workers, and leading them into prostitution, crime, starvation, or death in some cases. And so, but at the same time, they're taking the moral high road by doing that. Okay. After all, think about it. Labor unions, what would be their motivation? Serving the people who pay their dues, or serving strangers under the age of 18 in Indonesia? what do you think is the motivation behind American labor unions in advocating higher pay in Indonesia? I'd say if you think they're Mother Teresa's and just are concerned about the children, that you need to stay here at least 2 weeks, not 1 week. Here. On female labor, another example of what motivates that, the female labor restrictions, a real clear example, in the early 1980s, the United States government banned homework in the state of Vermont. There were married women, mostly, in Vermont, who had invested about $10,000 or so in these sort of commercial sewing machines that could be used to sew ski sweaters, ski caps, gloves, mittens, things like that, and they were selling them to Kmart and other retailers. And these women were staying at home, never getting out of their pajamas, kids are with them, making $10 an hour, and they're perfectly happy with this. But the Amalgamated Ladies Garment Workers Union, whose president was a man, I remember this, I wrote an article about this at the time, as I remember some of the details, got the United States Department of Labor to ban this type of work because they said these women were being exploited by being paid only $10 an hour by the retailers, whereas the unions were paying $12 an hour, something higher than that. And they actually held hearings in Congress, in the United States Senate Labor and Human Resources Committee, which Senator Orrin Hatch chaired at the time, held hearings, so there's a whole record of this. And these ladies showed up in Washington, and they basically said, we're not being exploited, we love doing this. It's the winter time, we don't have to get in a car and go somewhere, we don't have to buy food, we're our own babysitters, we don't have to hire babysitters. $10 an hour in 1980 in Vermont is not bad. And then the unions are saying, yes, you are being exploited, yes, you are. And so, but of course, once again, it was an attempt to eliminate competition for union labor. That's the whole thing behind restrictions on female labor. Occupational licensing. So what time do we start? 4 o'clock? Okay. Occupational licensing. There are thousands of occupations in America that are licensed, and some of them aren't licensed severely enough, like economics, for example. But some of them, you can make a good case for a lot of these, that licensing is a decent idea, it protects quality and so forth. You can make some arguments for licensing. But for the most part, but you can also make an argument that the private sector could handle it much better too, as far as licensing and credentialing goes. But for the most part, occupational licensing is a means of creating barriers to entry into occupations. There are many examples. There's an article in the New York Times about, when I was in New York City at the time when I read this, so this one must have been May. I was there the early May of, they just decided to sell a few more licenses for cab drivers. The city of New York has a fixed number of what they call medallions for cab drivers, and the news was they decided to add 10,000 or something. They decided to add some more, and they only do this once in a blue moon. They very rarely do this. And they had a picture of this guy who was a recent immigrant who had worked at odd jobs for several years, and he saved up and he borrowed from friends and relatives $35,000 as a down payment on his $150,000 taxi license. And so this was a young guy, I forget where he's from, I think it's from, wherever he was from, and he scraped together the $35,000 as sort of a down payment on a mortgage, essentially. And it said he had to make $2,500 a month on his loan payment, just to pay off his loan payment, driving a cab. And then, so just that, he had to make that much per month just to break even with his loan payment, not to mention the cost of insurance and gasoline and everything else for the guy. And they said if he's lucky and he works like a dog, he'll make $30,000 to $35,000 a year living in New York City. And so that's an extreme example of occupational licensing and how it restricts entry into industries. But there, like I said, there are thousands of occupations. There's a law firm, a public interest law firm in Washington, D.C. called the Institute for Justice. Has anybody ever heard of that? Some of you libertarian types may have heard of them. It was started by a guy named Clint Bolick and who's the other guy? I know it was him and someone else. And they take on cases for free. They have donors who donate money, mostly of people who have been deprived of jobs or occupations, livelihoods, through government regulation. And one of their very first cases that ended up on 2020 on ABC News was a man who quit his crappy government job in D.C. He was a low-level government bureaucrat, and he was just tired of it, he hated it. And he became a bit of an entrepreneur. He decided that Washington, D.C., he saw everybody walking around town in pretty decent business suits, and men and women, but their shoes always looked like crap. And so he decided, well, there's a market there for shoe shining. And the only shoe shining he ever saw was sort of inside some of the malls or inside some of the stores in D.C. And so he hired several dozen people, and I think most of them were homeless people or previously homeless people, who he put up the money for the shoe shine equipment and whatever, which is not a lot of big investment. And so he started his own little business of people all around the city shining shoes, so that when you go into your meeting to try to bribe Congressman Blowhard of robbing the Treasury in your behalf, you'll have nice shiny shoes in addition to your expensive suit. And so, and it worked. He made money, and he got these homeless guys off they made enough money to find a roommate or two and actually live with a roof over their head. But it angered the merchants. And so some of the merchants who had shoe shining businesses in their malls or in their stores got the city government to enforce a 100-year-old regulation that made it illegal to do this on the street. And I don't know what the purpose of that regulation was 100 years ago. So, and his name was Ego Brown. I remember it because it's kind of a memorable name. Ego Brown was the shoe shine guy's name. And the Institute for Justice represented him, and they won. They beat the Washington, D.C. city government, and they ended up on national television with this. And then there was another case that they won. There was a man and wife who braided hair, cornrows. They just braided hair into cornrows. That's all they did. No chemicals, no cutting, braiding. They had 5 or 6 employees, and what they did was just that. And of course, they had no cosmetology license, and so there were other hair places, hair cuttery places, that would cut your hair, dye your hair, shave your head, and do cornrows. And so they protested to the city government again and said, these people didn't go to 2 years of cosmetology school. They need to do that to be able to braid hair. And so the city of Washington, D.C. put them out of business and told them they would have to go to school for 2 years to become licensed cosmetologists to braid hair. And they were out of work. And of course, it wasn't just the cost of tuition. It was the lost income, the opportunity cost of their livelihood being lost for 2 years or longer. They could do this. And again, the Institute for Justice represented them and won. They're back in business. There are hundreds of stories like this that you could tell. And so occupational licensing is a major type of unemployment, cause of unemployment. One of the final things I'd like to mention is there's an old theory. Since it's the end of the day, I like to keep you to the very end and see how much I can torture you all and make your rear ends hurt from sitting on these chairs all day long. It's just me. It's just my personality. I like to torture. But one of the old Marxian theories about wages that is still some people still seem to believe in is the subsistence theory of wages. That employers will eventually, pay employees just a bare subsistence, and they'll barely get along. And this seems to be behind a lot of This theory was popular in the 19th century, early 20th century, and it's still popular. It seems to be the thinking behind this whole living wage movement, and there are more and more books being written now about the working poor, and that there are people who are maybe off of welfare fairly recently and are discovering that it's hard to live like Bill Gates at an entry-level job. There's a really horrible book by Barbara Ehrenreich called Nickel and Dimed about this. It's a PhD biologist, Barbara Ehrenreich, who went around in disguise, apparently. I don't know if she had one of those fake glasses with a big nose or anything, but she took jobs at fast food places and restaurants and then wrote a whole book about how hard it is to make ends meet on entry-level fast food pay. And the whole thing I thought was asinine, because she's a PhD biologist, and most people don't get a PhD in biology and then apply at Wendy's for a hamburger flipper job. But anyway, this thinking, this subsistence theory of wages seems to be the ideology behind these kinds of books that are still being written nowadays. But the thing that they ignore, the big mistake they make, is they ignore the importance of capital investment. Because what basically happens is that with capital investment by employers, we're talking historically, leads to an increase in the marginal product of labor, okay, and wages, because there are more workers are more productive, which in turn leads to increased production. More stuff is produced, more supply, in other words, which in turn reduces prices. So what you have as a result of capital investment is it makes labor more productive, therefore labor is paid more stuff gets produced, which reduces prices, so the workers benefit on two counts. They get higher nominal wages, and the things they buy go down in price as a result of capital investment. So they make out in both ways. And on top of that, if there's technological advance, employers are not just buying different capital, but if they're investing in research and development and developing new technologies, that does the same thing. That increases the marginal product of labor also and causes the exact same thing to happen. And so if you look at the real world of the capitalism, that this idea that over time there'll be wages will tend towards the subsistence level has never been accurate. It's never happened. In a capitalist economy, we've never seen it. But the idea is still popular because of probably the unawareness, the unaware of how this works. Okay, and that's an important thing to keep in mind, I think. And maybe with a few minutes left, I'll end there. I had a few more things about the Industrial Revolution here that I wanted to say. But I'll see if anybody has a question.
Yeah, I have a question. You mentioned that wages tend towards the marginal revenue product of the firm.
In competitive labor markets.
Yeah. My question is, what if, doesn't that assume that each firm has the same, the same workers at the different firms will have the same marginal revenue product? I mean, what if one firm has, say, superior management techniques or a team structure that gives their workers a higher marginal revenue product?
Yeah.
The same worker would have at a rival firm.
Yeah.
Wouldn't this allow the firm to pay the worker lower, stable, wouldn't the equilibrium wage for this worker be lower than his marginal revenue product at this firm because his competitors could not possibly pay, the same marginal revenue product wage as the superior firm?
Would the wage be lower at the superior firm, you said?
No, I'm saying if one firm has superior management, that gives their worker, the same worker at their firm, a higher marginal revenue product than the same worker who, if he switched to a rival firm, would have.
Oh yeah, that's not inconsistent with marginal product theory of labor, though. A good example of that is a company called Lincoln Electric that has been studied to death by management specialists, because Lincoln Electric's they manufacture I think like refrigerators and things like this, and they've been around since I think 1916. Located I think in Cleveland, and they've paid piece rate pay ever since 1916. And what that means is if you're putting together a refrigerator, you get paid a very low salary by industry standards, but then you get paid for every refrigerator that goes out the door that you work on. You get a piece of that. You get a piece rate on that. However, if it gets returned by the customer, you have to fix the problem at your own on your own time. So that's how they get rid of the problem of providing an incentive to put 10,000 refrigerators out the door, none of which work, because if you pay people on piece rate pay. But anyway, this system, and also they let the employees themselves sit in on the meetings where they determine what their piece rate's going to be and what all the rules are, and so they have a superior management strategy and philosophy, and has been recognized in management books for many, many decades. And as a result, the output per worker is 2.5 times the average for American manufacturing, and the pay is 2.5 times of what American manufacturing pays. So sure, if you were to quit Lincoln Electric and go work for some other comparable firm that doesn't have this superior management, you wouldn't be as productive at that firm because of that human capital. The managerial human capital is different. But that's totally consistent with marginal productivity theory. It doesn't say that everybody in the entire industry would be paid the same as them. So I think our time is up. Is that okay? Is that the peace sign or 2 fingers? Okay. What does that mean? Okay. I think you had your hand up.
I don't know if you'd know, but how do firms tend to decide prices for things like services? They don't necessarily have any real physical value. Like an operator, something like that.
Well, trial and error, I guess. Yeah, if it was me, I would try charging some outrageously high price, and if no one comes around, I'll drop my price till I can start getting takers. I guess yeah, that's what I would do. I think that's what a firm would. One time for one more. I think you had your hand up first.
I was wondering if you could comment on these. You're talking about child labor in the teenage market.
Yeah.
These things called training wages, where you pay, $4 an hour, whereas minimum wage is $8. Where does that come from? I'm assuming there's no teenage workers union.
Training wages? Who has that?
Well, it's in British Columbia.
Oh, in Canada. So it's that explains everything.
Well, they do it in other parts of the world as well.
Yeah. A training wage. I wouldn't know unless I actually researched this. So I can only guess because if I wanted to find out the answer, I would look at there must have been some sort of legislative hearings that where they had witnesses arguing for this before it was actually made a law. So that's what the first thing I would do to find out the answer would be to see what the advocates of these things were saying at the time. They might have been lying, but you can sniff that out usually. But it could be that they've recognized the reality that teenagers are priced out of work if you have a law that says you have to pay a teenager with no work experience $8 an hour when they can only produce $4 an hour for you in profit. So maybe it's a capitulation to that reality.
Consistent with the Austrian thing, which is another bad.
No, that would be a good thing, I suppose. If it's a sort of a suspension of the minimum wage law. In this country, we've had something similar in that that minimum wage, what is it, $5.15 an hour? It's been quite a while since there was a significant increase in the minimum wage. It hasn't been that. There was a tiny increase several years ago, but that's one of the best things the U.S. government has done in labor policy in decades, to essentially let inflation erode the real value of the minimum wage and make it irrelevant, so that it doesn't drive mostly younger people and mostly minority youth out of work. In the 1960s, there were studies of black teenage unemployment of being 60-70% among black teenagers who wanted a job, and this is not quite as bad nowadays, thanks to the fact that the minimum wage doesn't have as much teeth as it did in the 1960s, 1950s, and so it's sort of similar though. It's sort of letting it go by the wayside, just like in antitrust law. Looking the other way and just not enforcing the antitrust laws has been going on for about 25 years now in the area of mergers to a very large extent, which I think is a good thing. The laws are on the books, but if they're not enforced, that's a good thing. Same with the minimum wage law. If it's there, but it becomes irrelevant, that's a good thing. Okay, I guess we're out of time. It's time to put on the feed bag.